Welcome to the Good Life Podcast, a place where we can come together to seek God's truth, talk about our faith, and encourage one another in our walk with Christ. I'm your host, Tyler King, and whether you're driving to work, doing some chores around the house, or just needing a moment of peace in your day, we're so happy to have you with us. Today, I have Dale joining me, and always excited to hear what Dale has in store for us. It's always different, and so that always excites me as someone who loves change and loves surprises. Dale, how are you?
We're good, thank you.
I imagine this is probably a somewhat busy time of year for you with your gardening and as we get some warmer weather and all the preparations that you're doing.
Yes, and a lot of activities with grandchildren as well, which is just such a pleasure to be close enough to do that. So, yeah. But I love the brown turning to green in the spring coming, so that's always fabulous.
Yes, yeah. Where we're at in Edmond, I'll go south on Bryant, which is kind of a hilly area, and then I'll cut over and then connect up to the turnpike and make our way over to North Mac. And one of the things that I love seeing is as you kind of crest the top of one of those hills, you just see the sea of green. And, you know, not that I don't like winter. I like the cold weather, kind of. I don't like it too cold, just like I don't like it too hot. I don't know. I guess I'm picky in that regard. But just seeing all of the green's my favorite color. And it just, I don't know, so much life.
Yeah.
And I love spring for that.
Great time of year.
Well, we've got interesting topics. So last week, I talked with Jeremy as someone who has worked in youth ministry for 13 years. I'd say he's gotten to know the youth of the church very well. And I think that's kind of a rarity, unfortunately, in our church that we just don't have a lot of youth ministers who last 13 years in youth ministry. Sometimes it's just a stepping stone ministry. And in some ways, I understand that. But in other ways, I think it's really commendable that Jeremy has put in 13 years of his time dedicated to the youth. And I think the youth group has been, blessed by that. And so over those 13 years, Jeremy has gotten to know their mannerisms, the way that they think, the way that they look at life and their worldview. And last week we talked about if they had a platform and if they could reach out to the older generation of our congregation or the older generation of just the church at Broad, what are some things that they wish that the older generation knew about them? So this week we're kind of flipping the tables. We know that sometimes there's this disconnect between the youth and the older generations. One of my favorite things growing up that we did as a youth group was called BOTA, B-O-T-A, Banquet of the Ages. And it's where we let, older generation, now that I'm 30, 55 doesn't seem too far off, but we would let anyone who is 55 and up come to BOTA and the youth group would serve them. And so we always did a theme for it. It was one night a year. And so we'd do like a Titanic theme, or we'd do a France theme, or we would do a Grand Canyon theme. And the older generation of the church would sit down and we would bring them food. We would engage with them with conversation and games and ask them questions. And it was always just such a good time because we got to learn more about them. And I feel like sometimes there's a disconnect that stuff like that only happens so often, where you get the younger generation interacting with the older generation. And so, I don't know, I don't consider you technically in the older generation, but you're older than the youth group. But you also have dealt with, in your ministry, just many people of different ages. And so I thought you'd be very well-rounded on this topic of if the older generation had a platform, what are some things that they wish the younger generation knew about them in terms of spirituality, in terms of tradition, in terms of culture. So I'll kind of just let you run with that.
Well, and just a couple of things by way of background. When I was going through Oklahoma Christian, I was there from 70 to 74. I was in 3 different congregations where I was the first youth minister that they ever had. And that just continued on when we go to Australia, then helping with church camp. We were a part of 5 retreats a year. One was with older people, but we had a younger group there. And that was always just such an encouraging thing. And so, this is one of these, only the Lord knows, but I would guess we'd worked with over 5,000 kids at different times. And much like Jeremy, when you stay at one place, then there's just an amazing, group of people that you get to talk with. One of the things that, and I'm looking at this from the older to the younger, is there's a sense that the younger people may not appreciate how much joy, encouragement it is to the older generation to see those who are younger, who are faithful, and who participate in things. The young women in our congregation have had a strong tradition of having Tim's outline and listening very carefully and serving and doing that. And the younger generation probably doesn't see it as much from our point of view, that when you see the younger generation participating, involved in things like that, then that is just really such a source of encouragement. And in 3 John, John will say, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking according to the truth. And I think that's extended into our spiritual family as well.
Mm-hmm.
I brought a picture that only Tyler will be able to see, but it's a picture of society in the first century, and it's like a bullseye. It's a target type diagram, but in the very center is the term oikonomia, and oikos is just the word for house, and it's used over 100 times in the New Testament, and obviously it will be a physical house where Jesus goes into a house, but spiritually, then the church will start being called the household of God, the household of faith. And in a house, it wasn't just mom, dad, and the kids. It was oftentimes kind of like an Italian or a Greek family that has a trade or a business, and they live in the upstairs, and it's mom, dad, and the grandparents, and maybe aunts and uncles and everyone else. And I think that picture of the household of faith is something that's really important. And as our generation gets older, it's a greater source of encouragement for us to see the younger generation participating and involving in, whether it's our young men who are mighty men who are doing the service, or whether it's our young ladies doing their activities, especially that they've been doing. All of those things are a great source of encouragement.
Well, it's interesting that you start off on a positive note. Sometimes when we talk about disconnects between generations, sometimes the younger generation doesn't see that delight or that joy, or they don't understand it, probably just in part that they're not spending a lot of time with the older generation. But to know, first off, that there is a joy amongst the older generation to see the younger generation in the church. Unfortunately, with my previous job working at Bear Valley, just looking and paying attention to a lot of these different churches across the nation. I mean, we had students come from all sorts of different places. I mean, literally from California to New York and everywhere in between. And that meant that we would travel out and that we would gain connections to all of these churches, big cities, small towns, rural towns, everywhere. And unfortunately, more often than not, we would see these small churches just eventually close their doors because there was no youth. And so I think probably from an older generation standpoint, they see these young people and they see, wow, there's still hope, there's still life, there's still energy in God's church and God's household. And, it's still coming to light. I know a lot of parents struggle with that idea of being empty nesters. They've seen their kids grown and raised, and now they're out of the house and they've got an empty house. And, some parents do well and they thrive with that. They go on vacations and they enjoy each other's presence once more just by themselves. But then you watch what happens when they turn into grandparents and they see that young life come back into their house and just the joy that's there.
Well, and one of the things that always, I wouldn't use the word odd, but it's a bit unusual. On the cross, Jesus doesn't entrust his mother into someone in his physical family. And you just stop and think, why would you entrust Mary into the hands of John, one of the disciples, when we know there were at least 4 brothers and we just have a plural of sisters, so we know there's at least 6 kids in the physical family. And I've always just wondered, of course we don't know, but I wonder, there again is Jesus talking about the importance of our spiritual family, being a family and looking after and caring for each other. We had an older couple at Eastside who didn't have any of their grandchildren close by physically. And so they adopted, and I put that in quotation, 2 of the younger boys at church who didn't have any other family other than mom and dad. There's not a 4 and 6-year-old boy who's going to complain about going to Brahms Sunday night after church.
Yeah.
And so they went to their activities. They just adopted them with, obviously they didn't live in their house, but in terms of activities and interest. And I think as much as we can kind of be intergenerational, and in some of the really small churches in Australia, there may be only 30 or 40 people. Well, that church is a family. They do all kinds of activities together, and you don't have so much of a youth group as such, which I'm all for, but the church was just a total family as such. And I think as much as we can extend family activities and family culture into a larger church, then that's healthy for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of carrying along with that, what are some other things that if the older generation had a platform to speak on? One of the things that Jeremy had brought up is sometimes there's a disconnect in understanding that the younger generation is still spiritual, even though they may not look spiritual. And when we dive into the topic of tradition, I know growing up for me in our household, it was always wear your Sunday best. And
Sure.
I used to fight my mom on that since a kid. And that's not where my resistance comes from in modern day. But I remember as soon as the final amen was said at church, I would untuck my shirt. I just hated my shirt being tucked in. And I think there's sometimes a disconnect in appearance and tradition. There's sometimes a chasm between old songs and new songs. And I think that as we consider this differentiation between older and newer, sometimes the younger generation doesn't appreciate older songs or older methods of doing something. And yet there's still some tenacity of the older generation that hangs on to those. So why do you think that is? Is it because it's proven that it works? Is it because there's wisdom and experience behind there?
Well, and a part of it is the older songs are songs of our heart. Growing up in the congregation at Sayre, we probably had about 30 of our extended family who were members of the church. And so at a point in time, you went and sat with Uncle Herbert because he sang tenor. This is Lance's grandfather. And so there might be 2 or 3 years, not every service, but typically you went and sat with the uncle who sang tenor. The girls went and sat with Nancy because she sang alto. And then when your voice changed a little bit, then you went and sat with Granddad Luther because he sang bass. And so we literally moved the younger members of the family by family members who sang that part. And so when we got together, it was just this wonderful blend of voices because that was something that was just a part of our family. My great uncle on Sunday evenings, especially through the summer, would invite people back. They would have sandwiches or something, have a light meal, and then they would literally start with the first song and would sing till 9:30 or 10 that night. So you've had Sunday morning worship, you've had Sunday evening worship, and a lady I talked with years later, she said, my husband was a patrolman. He couldn't come Sunday morning. And she said he would come out and join in the last part, would have the Lord's Supper. But you stop and think, if you sing 5 hours on most Sundays, those songs are all a part of you. And so when you've been used to singing songs of the heart that are familiar and are close to you, and I can hear the voices of my uncle and my grandfather in some of these songs because I sat with them to learn how to sing the part, you don't have any of that same kind of emotion and feeling with a brand new song. So I think a part of it is there's a part of the heritage, the history, the love of the previous people that's a part of that. And the older songs, not all, but more of the older songs tend to have less repetition and more of an extended thought. And so, like, we did a church camp with a song, One Sweetly Solemn Thought comes to me o'er and o'er. Today, I'm nearer to my home than e'er I've been before. And then every verse then expands on what's it like to be thinking about the brevity of life and the certainty of eternity. That's very different than a lot of our newer songs that are more repetitive. And so, and I would just use the term, for some of the older people, those are songs of the heart, and we're glad to learn new songs. We're especially glad to sing songs that another part of the congregation responds well to. I was just trying to think of the best way to try to say that. But I laughed in a staff meeting recently because Tim just mentioned that he didn't know several of the songs that were sung on a Sunday night. And I quietly said, Tim, I sang every one of those from memory because those were songs, again, of the heart and songs of that. And so I think we have to meet each other kind of in the middle from both sides. And I understand that some of the older terminology, some of the quaint expressions, the young people may just roll their eyes or think, what does that mean? But then the other side is that for those of us that, yes, we learned those when we were younger, because they're songs of the heart, they have a whole different emotional meaning to us in addition to just the words and what they say, because they remind us of circumstances and circles and places that we were in. And I can understand that a younger generation doesn't bring any of those emotions to that older song. And so the same song can just have such a totally opposite response from different parts of the congregation. I'm pleased that we try to have a blend. I'm glad we're learning the new songs, but it also is still enjoyable that a song comes and I can just close my eyes and sing the entire song from memory. But it's not just the song, it's the memory of who you sang it with. It's the song that is something that's of your heart. And I laugh at this. I went on chorus trips with our kids when our kids were in junior high and high school. And we're on a bus getting ready to go to a musical contest somewhere. And there's two girls ahead of me that are in junior high. And one looks to the other and she says, "Who were the Beatles?" And I chose not to say anything.
Yeah, that's probably the wise choice.
But I'm just thinking, okay, if you grew up in the 60s and the 70s, everybody knew who the Beatles are. Philip Slate, who was our missions teacher at Memphis, he said, "He who is married to culture will soon become a widow."
Yep.
And there's a lot of truth in that. Yes, we have an eternal truth, that's Scripture that never changes. But when you look at human culture, it is always changing. There's always a transition. And that just is always tucked away, that none of us want to get married culturally to this is the only or this is the best or whatever, because I just hear that expression, he who is married to culture will soon become a widow.
Yeah. I read one of the books for my master's study. It was by Francis Schaeffer, who's a phenomenal writer anyways, but it's kind of his most well-known book, How Then Shall We Live, or How Should We Then Live? I forget how he phrases that, but he basically goes through and walks through all the different time periods of church history and analyzes it from an art and music and even architecture standpoint, and how that culture reflects that time period's perception of God. And so, for instance, you go through the Gothic phase and you have these massive cathedrals that point toward heaven and just the grand and the awe of it. And then you move into maybe the Renaissance phase and how that's completely different and a lot more charisma and a lot more drama involved in that. And even with the paintings, you see the difference between Renaissance and Gothic and even modern day interpretations of that. But I think you bring up a very interesting point. So really, it's just kind of a sterilization between the two. So for older generations that hear these newer songs, they don't have memories tied to them.
Exactly.
But for these younger generations who hear these old songs, they don't have memories attached to them. And so it's almost like the older generation hears these newer songs and think, what in the world are we singing, and why does it sound so different, and what is going on? And the younger generation, I would say my generation included, because sometimes I've had some kickback. You know, sometimes some of the songs that we sing sound like a Civil War march. And I'm thinking, I've never been out on sea. I mean, I can't swim, so that's probably a good thing. But I don't know what it's like to be lost at sea. I know what it's like to be lost spiritually, but that imagery is just vast on me.
Exactly.
I have no clue. But it's interesting to dive deeper than just, even the surface level of the lyrics of the song, but more of where is our allegiance to the song and what are some of the memories and heritage behind those. But that's very interesting to think about. And for the younger generation of these new songs, they sing them at summer series, they sing them at camp.
Sure.
And so that's where their memories come in. Or they just hear them and they like the tune and the words to them. Whereas older generations, they think of maybe parents or grandparents or family with them.
Well, and just another thing on Psalms, a random quote from Martin Luther, I don't care who writes your theology if I can write your hymns.
Mm-hmm.
Because you stop and think, there are songs that especially on the radio, we hear the first 2 or 3 words and then we can sing the whole song by memory.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do that with the same capacity with a chapter in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And those songs are tucked away. And one of the things, and again, here is a generational difference, but I'd love for you just to notice how many of our new songs are evangelistic.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm not dispersing all of our new songs are bad, but just as a category, and speaking with my brother who goes to chapel at Oklahoma Christian, our comment was we were singing Send the Light, Lead Me to Some Soul Today,
Mm-hmm.
Seeking the Lost. A big part of our hymnology, our repertoire of songs, had very evangelistic thrust, emphasis in the songs.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, I try to go in the summer to church camps where my grandchildren are. So other than my grandchildren, I don't know any of these other people. I'm just there for a visitor for the night. But just one thing that's tucked in the back of my mind is, when is the last time that we have had a new song that is just really heartfelt, evangelistic? And so for those listening, those who may be writing songs or do that,
Mm-hmm.
I think, that, again, and this is a generational thing as well, but I think it would be helpful if we had more of our newer songs that had some focus on, and praising God is wonderful. That's why we're here. The idea of worship is wonderful, but we also are really impacted by the focus and the emphasis of our songs. And that's a part of why some of the older songs will have more of an evangelistic tone. And we go through cycles of things, and there may come a time where that's more important. But you just stop and listen to the newer songs, and there's not, I'll just say it this way, there's not as strong an emphasis on evangelism as there was at one time within our fellowship.
Yeah, absolutely. I've noticed that as well. And I would be hard-pressed to find a newer song that has an evangelistic undertone. And again, I think that's like Francis Schaeffer as he talks about the differences between culture. And I love that thought of, if you're married to culture, you'll end up being widowed, because it's absolutely true. Culture changes so much, and you can't just set your anchor down in a timeless point in culture. You're going to get blown past with all of that. But yeah, I definitely think that lends itself toward the generational difference of this younger generation, Gen Z, even some of the college students that I work with. They're a lot more, not emotional in the bad sense of they just can't keep their emotions in check. That's not at all. But they're a lot more heartfelt and individualistic. And I think that's part of just our society and the way that things have moved. A bigger emphasis on mental health, a bigger emphasis on self-care and things like that. Whereas you look at older generations and there was more of a camaraderie type of atmosphere of, you have a lot of wars going on. And so here's our team. We need more people on our team to build up our team more. And now it's, I'm hurting, I need help. And so I'm reaching out to God. And so it is interesting how there is a shift of, some songs are purely evangelistic of, I'm going to go out and I'm going to reach out to the world to save the lost. And then there's the flip side of that of, I am lost, I need help. And like you said, I think a balance of both would be great. But yeah, I definitely agree. I think newer songs, it would be good if we could get them more in tune with that. And I didn't mean for a big chunk of our time together to be spent on songs, but I think that's probably one of the biggest chasms from a generational standpoint in the church right now is you have young people who roll their eyes at old songs that they can't understand. And I mean, I'll admit, being 6 hours away from finishing my MDiv, there are songs that I still try to wrestle with in terms of what in the world are those lyrics talking about? I've read books, I've written papers, and I still don't know what we're talking about. But then there's also older generations who hear these new songs and they roll their eyes. And so you have something that's just obviously, a chasm between these two different sides. And I think if we could just stop and pause and reflect on why is that, I think there's a little bit more of a communion that can be had between the two.
Well, and different generations will, can I say, have different strengths.
Yeah.
And like, for example, my brother Kent's been at Oklahoma Christian, for 25 years. And in a complimentary way, talking about, again, the earlier group of students, he said, these kids have a great heart for service. Mm-hmm. And he said, the clubs will have all kinds of service projects. He said the kids are really into that, really involved, and reaching out and helping people and serving and those kinds of things. And I think generationally, we can have different strengths, things that we're drawn to. And I think that's also a part of the importance of having, again, a household, so that as a church, we're not just only strong in one area. And I think different generations can add different things. One of the things that I think is encouraging is the older generation really appreciates and enjoys our younger generation participating in things. And I think a part of the spirit of this church is that is such a helpful thing. When I was a student at Oklahoma Christian, we did a lot of youth rallies. I think one year and again, there was a whole group of guys, but we spoke to nearly 15,000 young people in a year. So that was generationally, that was a big emphasis. And I was just a small part of that, but a weekend came up and I got my slip of paper and it says, 2 weeks from now, you will be speaking at Memorial Road on Sunday morning. And I go, what? It was College Church then, but I missed the meeting, and so I didn't get to defend myself. There were 2 youth rallies that weekend, and our president was at the other one, and so he assigned me to speak at Memorial Road on Sunday morning, and I'm thinking, I have no business speaking at Memorial Road on Sunday morning, and I actually went and spoke to the preacher, who was Morris Thurman, and I just said, I felt like Moses making excuses to God. I can't do this, and on and on. And I just told him, I said, this, I was volunteered to do this, and I didn't do the volunteering. Anyway, he just looked at me and he smiled, and I just listed, I said, James Baird will be there, Stafford North will be there, and we had 2 or 3 older preachers who might be there, and I just listed, and I said, I have no business speaking on Sunday morning. And he looked at me and he said, but what you don't understand is that these older guys will be thrilled to death to listen to someone younger learning how to do this, because they know what's involved in learning the process. And rather than being your biggest critics, they will actually be your biggest supporters. And I experienced that at Eastside Midway City. Yes, I'd been preaching for a number of years. Do you know how intimidating it is to have David Roper listening to every lesson that you give?
Yeah.
And he always had a 3x5 card in his pocket, and he'd sit in the same chair in the back, and he'd whip that card out. And even if he had to use creative imagination, he found something to compliment about every lesson. But it was really intimidating on my part because, here he is. He's written all these commentaries, and he's preached longer than I've been alive, and you go through the whole list. And I would hope that as a family, an extended family, a church family, that we as the older generation try to find opportunities to do everything we can to encourage the younger generation to grow in their faith. And I've mentioned this publicly. While we lived in Memphis, I went for a weekend to a church down in Mississippi, a couple of hours at least, a rural area. And there was one family that had two young teenage kids, who knows, 12, 14 maybe. Everyone else was 70 and older.
Hmm.
And I just had a sober drive back home, and I thought, is there going to be a church here in 20 years?
Hmm.
Because if these kids grow up and get a job somewhere else, and if mom and dad move, there was no one else in the church that wasn't of that, older generation. Every Sunday morning when I hear a baby cry in our audience, I just smile.
Mm.
To me, that is such a heartwarming thing. And yes, I know we don't want to have too much noise. I understand that. But I think about visiting that church that Sunday. They didn't have any babies crying.
Mm.
It was very proper, very solemn, very appropriate. But it would have been wonderful to have a baby cry in a church like that. And so I think from the older generation, that's something that we should just continually be grateful for. And every time we can have an opportunity to encourage our younger generation participating in whatever level that they can in the church, that should be an opportunity for us to encourage them.
Well, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm just having to bank on research and reading and talking to others about their experience. But it seems like to me, one of the biggest times for the church, at least in this country, for it to grow was the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And again, that's kind of where we had, a lot of these newer, I put that in quote too, it's newer songs that came in. It's where you have the Joy Bus that is happening. It's where VBS is starting to just really thrive and become something monumental. And I've always been curious, what was it that made the church just thrive in this country in the 70s, 80s, and 90s? I mean, Bear Valley at one point was in the 500s, which is staggering to me, growing up there and seeing it. I mean, when we were growing up, it was probably 350. We would push 400 occasionally, but to think about that congregation being that size and just tons of people coming to the church. And, we went to go see a movie a few years ago that was all about the big Jesus movement in this country. And you had all the different, they called themselves the Jesus freaks, where they were just super evangelistic. But it seems like the church functioned the best when people didn't care about age, when that just the lines got blurred between generational differences and they all just worked together. Is that your experience with, those different time periods of the church? Or do you have something else that you would say contributed to the growth and the booming of the church in that time period?
Yeah, I think all of those were a part of it. We also, and again, in my limited experience, we also had an older generation that was very inclusive. And, especially growing up in Sayre, we're a rural community, a farming community. My grandmother typically fed 12 to 16 people for lunch every day during the work season. And so we just didn't think of mom, dad, and the kids. It was just always kind of a collective us. And the church was such an important part of our lives because that provided a lot of social activities and other things. But I think in every generation, and talked about this in the last Wednesday night devotional, Paul comes into Corinth and God says, I have many people in this city. Don't be afraid, speak up. And I just think regardless of what the culture is around us, God is working in people's lives. And in every generation, we need to do what we can to serve him where we are. And like we have a couple of friends that are in small towns that the town itself is just virtually drying up compared to what it was 30 or 40 years ago. There's not the number of people that was there. There's not the younger people that were there, but they're faithful in the church where they are. And this is hard to say, but it's still true. A church can be terminal the same way that my physical body is terminal. And just because circumstances, well, like for example, we had a group of people, mainly military, who worshiped together. And, for a while the church had nearly 20 people in it, and it was just thriving and growing. One by one, they figured out that they all were going to get transferred. And so they wrote the last will and testimony of the church and then had the agreement, whoever's the last one, here's dispersing the funds, closing the bank account, everything else. And so, today there is not a church in that area, but the church that was there did amazing things, and while it functioned the best the capacity it could, they all moved into different areas. And so did that church die? In one sense, yes. Well, they were all transferred out. But how much stronger were they as they all transferred into other churches and other ministries? And so I think we just look at each church and each generation and think God has a purpose for it. And even some of these smaller churches that are dwindling compared to what they were, they're still salt and light in that community, but it may not be anything like it was 40 or 50 years ago because the economy, the age of the people there, and all that changes. So in a given location, a church may become terminal, but the church universal is going to continue, while individual churches can kind of come and go.
Oh, that's very interesting to think about and to consider. And I mean, I think an encouraging twist on, some of the smaller congregations out in those rural areas where, wow, we're closing our doors again, and we're closing up the church. And it's like, no, the church will always, this is the church of Daniel too. It's the kingdom that will last forever. And I think what you said, that God has a purpose for every church in every generation. And the quicker that we can realize that, the better off we'll be.
Well, and my favorite verse on David for years and years was, he's the man after God's own heart. And that's so true. But in that same passage in Acts 13, it says, David served the purpose of God in his generation. And you think for each one of us, that will be uniquely different. How can I, in this generation, serve the purpose of God? And what God called someone to do during World War II, or, like I'm growing up during Vietnam, and what God is calling us to do today, the focus may be different. We may be in a different location, but we each can still be involved in serving the purpose of God in our generation.
Yeah, I love that.
Can I do a commercial?
Yeah.
The elders have asked me to spend more time in activities with our 75 and older group, because we just have a wonderful group of older people. Some are shut in or things. As new deacons are appointed, because some will be involved in doing that, we're going to be trying to have more specific activities. And for example, as we get our new youth worker family here and they get established probably after the marathon of the summer, then what are some activities and things that we can do that are intergenerational that we can do, as you were talking about, with our young people and our older people, that we can have activities and share things together. So if anyone has any suggestions or thoughts of things that would be helpful to have contact with, to encourage, to reach out and strengthen and help, especially the older generation. But one of my first thoughts is, yes, and as you were mentioning, it would be great to plan some activities where we deliberately have our younger people with our older. Our middle daughter did this the most, but each of our three kids did this growing up. Occasionally, rather than sitting with the youth group, they would sit with adopted older people in the church. We had two men, and they were wonderful men. One of them had never been married. There's not an 8-year-old boy that's more allergic to girls than he was in his 70s. The other fellow was a widower, and so these two men, they were close friends, and they sat together. None of the widows were close by. They didn't want to have anything to do with this. And so my daughter's a sophomore. She's about 5'7", whatever, and I just was standing at the back. She walks past these men, and then she snaps her finger, and then she turns around, and she jumps in their lap. And 4 hands, just like a robbery, 4 hands just go up because this sophomore girl has jumped in these 70-year-old men's. They're absolutely in panic. She wiggled around, and then the next thing you know, she's sitting in between the two of them and has her arm hooked around them. And when I come by, she says, "Father, have you seen my latest boyfriends?" And so, who knows, once a month or so, she would go and sit with these two guys for worship. And I'm using an idiom and expression. They just nearly busted the buttons of their shirts off when a sophomore girl came and sat with them for worship. They were just thrilled to death to do that. And so each of our kids at different times adopted an older couple or an older person to sit with. And you think, wouldn't that be wonderful that you don't have a physical, wasn't just like the man, he was the only one in his family that was there. His older mother had passed away. The serendipity, and this was not the intent originally, but the serendipity was, as Heather went on campaigns or something later, he would quietly come to me and he said, how much does our girl need to go on this campaign? And I just said, well, look, and kind of hesitated a little bit. And he said, here's the deal. He said, I haven't paid any dentist bills. I don't have to buy shoes. He went through the list of stuff. And he said, if our girl is short on any funds on this campaign, you let me know because I want her to be able to go on this. She didn't do that for monetary things, but from his point of view, if you have a sophomore in high school who worships with you regularly, she's become a part of his family. Mm-hmm. She's become a part of that circle. And so I just think everything that we can do to have an intergenerational activity, intergenerational participation is really healthy, because I think that lets all of us then experience more of a family type dimension within the church. And it's more of a challenge in a larger church, but that still means we also have some opportunities that we wouldn't have if we were a much smaller church as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, and hopefully this has been a blessing to anyone who's been listening, and we'll catch you next week.